Greetings from Tokyo, my friends. This is Daisuke, and I'm here because it is my pleasure and distinct honor to be able to discuss with you, in very general terms, I admit, the Ingmar Bergman's Cinema Criterion Collection box set. Today I'd like to talk to you about Centerpiece 3. This is Centerpiece 3. So this is the grouping of certain films that Criterion has arranged in a particular order. And this is coming towards the end of that order. So let me talk to you today about Centerpiece 3. Now, I have to say that, again, for those of you who are not wanting to hear what the order of the films is, I perfectly understand, because I think part of the joy of experiencing this box set is, of course, perhaps the order of the Criterion creation. And so for many people, or for some people at least, that might mean not wanting to be spoiled by what the order is before watching the films and experiencing the set for himself or herself. If that is the case for you, then please stop this video right now, because I will be talking about the order of the films. And so please, again, if you do not want to be spoiled by what is the order of the films, please stop the video now, and then you can come back at any time after you have completed Centerpiece 3. Let me tell you what the order of the films in Centerpiece 3 is. First is Persona. Next is Thirst. Then comes the film Port of Call. And then Cries and Whispers. And then Waiting Women. And then Brink of Life. And finally, Autumn Sonata. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 films in Centerpiece 3. So this is 7 films, and as you can see, there are no films where there are 2 versions, like a TV version or a theatrical version, like we saw with Scenes from a Marriage some time back. So we just have 7 films, and none is that overly long, I would say. They are all very relatively short, and they are quite intense works of art from Ingmar Bergman. Some of them are incredibly intense. Now, we've seen a lot of films thus far that display a certain intensity, but there's something about this grouping which is, it seems to be an exemplar of all things intense, if you know what I mean. And I think an indication of that is the fact that it starts with the film Persona. But we'll get to that in a second. So, yes, so why don't we do this? And I should say also that the order here is very interesting because it starts with Persona, which is 1966, right? And then it goes to Thirst, which is 1949. And then Port of Call, which is 1948. So already you get this odd or interesting reverse chronological presentation. And then Cries and Whispers, which is 1972. And then Waiting Women, which is 1952. And then Brink of Life, which is 1958. And then finally Autumn Sonata, 1978. So this is very interesting indeed in terms of the chronology. So we have an interesting order structure here. So what I will do now is, for those of you who are interested, I will just touch briefly upon these films in the Criterion created order. As per my usual custom with these sorts of videos, I won't be going into any specific plot details or spoiler details with respect to each film. I usually do that in separate video forms, but with these Bergman Cinema Criterion Collection box set videos, I tend to just do a general overview of each film, touching upon the themes of them, seeing if there's any kind of thematic connection that might explain this Criterion curated order. So, but still, if you are wary of spoilers, then I would suggest that you stop this video and then wait until you watch these films. The video will always be here. I don't think it'll be deleted. So you can always come back at your own pace and leisure and watch the video after you feel comfortable enough to talk about these films. And then, again, when I talk about them, I won't be going into specific spoilers about what happens at the end of each film or something, but I will be touching upon general themes, and that might involve maybe a certain level of specificity in one aspect or another, and I will still try in that respect to avoid spoilers, but still. I think watching the films as fresh as possible yields many rewards. So if you are still here, then you don't mind being spoiled, or at least to a certain degree, by what I'm about to say. So the first film in the Centerpiece 3 curated order is, as I mentioned, Persona from 1966. This is, I would probably hazard a guess to say, is probably one of the most difficult films in Bergman's filmography, at least when included or when compared to the other films in this box set, for instance. There are many difficult films to understand and to comprehend in Ingmar Bergman's filmography, I admit. But Persona is one of the most challenging films I have ever seen. And it is challenging because I think it is a film that is a myriad combination, and it is one that is prone to myriad possibilities of interpretation. I really mean that. It feels so vibrant and alive and quite dense, and because of that density, there is so much mystery, and because of the mystery, there is quite an aura that is built up around the film, at least in my own mind. So it is at once a difficult film, and it is a challenging film for me, and it is so intense. Now, I mentioned that I think it's a film that is subject to a myriad of interpretations, and I really do believe that. I think some people might look at it primarily as, say, a psychological horror film. Maybe people might look at it as a film about the complexity of identity, and you add into the mix this idea of dueling identities, or the idea of one identity usurping the other or taking over the other. So there's this clash of ideas here, set in the backdrop of exploration of identity. And we can take that further, too, an exploration of identity set amid the backdrop of maybe a growing sense of self when it comes to sexuality, a growing sense of self when it comes to our place in the context of the unfolding events as they occur in the late 1960s, or the mid to late 1960s at least. And also this idea of I think also what it means to find expression when one is trying to be maybe a professional woman, an artist. We have an artist performer who seems to lose her voice, and so there is this notion of what that effect is on her, if at all. And also there is this idea, I think, of the sort of the personal relationships between women, and how they might, how should I put it, how intimate notions and feelings can be transmitted and can be conveyed and can be discussed between women, that in such discussions are perhaps impossible in other contexts. Now, I'm not sure to what degree that holds on a universal scale, But I think there is some kind of discussion here. And it's very significant that the fact that the two main characters that we spend most of our time with when we watch the film are the characters here. Alma, the nurse, and Elizabeth. So this is very significant. I think also what's going on here is a bit of another, maybe if we step back, where it's talking about this idea of maybe the impenetrability of others and the experience of the other. The idea also of what it means to exist within oneself. Now, I'm not a student of philosophy. I haven't studied philosophy formally. At least I took a philosophy course once in college, I think, but that was basically it. And so I'm not too expert when it comes to things like this, but I think this is, please correct me if I'm wrong, but this idea of being inside of yourself, at least on let's say a metaphysical level. I think it's called solipsism, or metaphysical solipsism, I think. And my point that I want to make, though, is if I get my terms wrong, I think the one I want to make is that this film seems to be talking about this idea of what it means to exist inside oneself, and how that can be a little bit, how should I put it? It's there's only so much that one can comprehend outside of oneself, and this idea of, if I'm talking to you or if you're talking to me, how much is it possible for me to really understand and appreciate what your experience is, because your experience, as much as I'm trying to listen to it, is still outside of my own world, right? Because I can only know what it is that I know up to a certain point. Then after we leave this boundary, or at least I leave this boundary, I can only infer, I can only guess. I can try to make as reasonable guess as possible, but I can only guess what your experience is based on what the words that you tell me, the things that you show me, and the ideas that you try to tell to me. So all this stuff is, it's not hearsay necessarily from my point of view, but it's you know what I mean. It's this idea of how much I can really understand what it is your experience is, and perhaps there's an impossibility there. And I think this is very important, because this idea goes and is, I think, transplanted by Bergman to the notion of film and the possibilities and also the limitations of film, and which is why I think we get this thing at the beginning with respect to this this young boy and film images. I think on the one hand, film is this idea that persona is almost an exercise in trying to show us, on the one hand, how film can penetrate that boundary, which is what I was speaking of before, the boundary of the other. It can penetrate it in a way that we can therefore understand what the experience of the other is. At the same time, I think Bergman is showing us the limitations of film. This idea of we think we can penetrate it, but in fact, the penetration itself is a mere illusion, and that we can only touch the surface to the best of our ability. And anything beyond that is impossible for us to truly experience, because it is outside ourselves. And I think that is at the heart, or at least one of the things that is at the heart of this iconic image, actually, which is from the film Persona. This idea of trying to understand and penetrate the other, but maybe being able, or thinking we are able to do so, but in fact it is quite impossible. And in fact, the issue of trying to penetrate the other is much more complicated than one might initially fathom. And then this is tied inextricably, I think, to the notion of sexuality. I mean, if we're talking about it in very base terms, right, or some might think crude terms, in which case I apologize, but this idea of penetration of the other, or experience of the other, the physical exchange with another human being, which is I think the very definition of physical sexuality. So I think what Bergman does in Persona, which is one of the great things about this film, in my opinion, is that I think he ties this idea of trying to connect with another person on an emotional level, and maybe thinking that we do but we aren't able to do, and he's tying that into the metaphor of cinema, how that is at once it can penetrate what the other is thinking, but then it can't. I think that's the whole, that ties in beautifully with sexuality and how sexuality is dealt with in this film. I think once very, it feels very honest, but at the same time, the more I think about it, the more I think that assessment of honesty deserves further scrutiny. We do get frank exchanges of discussions of sexuality in this film. And I think on the one hand, that's supposed to suggest, again, this idea of penetrating the other, what the other person is thinking or feeling. But then when we think about it, we might begin to doubt if that is indeed the whole picture, or if there is something more elusive that we can't quite grasp. And I think that is an appropriate thing to do, because one of the great mysteries, I think, or one of the most beautiful things, of course, is how we can relate to other human beings in this world while we're still alive. And of course, one of the ways we can do that is through sexuality, right? I mean, sexuality is one of the most, I would say, one of the most expressive ways that we can share with another human being, on whatever level of that specific sexuality that might mean. So this is a very important concept, of course, to the idea of a human expression, and therefore I think in terms of drama. So there are some images and stories here in Persona that go to the heart of that. I think it's at once very honest and open, and at the same time it's so mysterious and elusive. And I think the fact that we have some opening shots in this film, and if you look very quickly, this is not a spoiler because it's at the very beginning of the film. If you look very quickly at the opening shots of Persona, they go by very quick because there's a lot of cuts and there's a lot of random images of faces and stuff. But if you look very quickly, you can see, actually, at least in the version I see, it's so quick, it's very subliminal, but there is a shot of erect male genitalia, and so this is quite shocking, and it seems very random, but I think it's an indication of this notion, which I think is going on here, right? It's this idea of trying to penetrate the other, trying to understand the experience of the other. And this is expressed through explorations of sexuality, which we think are the be-all, end-all of what the experience of the other is. But perhaps the more we think about it, the more we realize that that is not telling the whole story. So this ultimately shows us, perhaps, potentially, the limitations of what it means to watch a film, and what it means when we watch a film, what we think of when we watch a film, and what we think of when we feel, or at least when I feel like I've penetrated the other, and what the characters are. But perhaps what Bergman is trying to show us is that indeed there is more to it than just watching, right? Perhaps there is an inherent impossibility in this idea of trying to connect with another. And you can take, if that's true, then you have to take it to the next level. Well, then, is this a kind of a crisis, an existential crisis or not? Or is this just another aspect of humanity that we must deal with? All fascinating issues. And they all come from this exploration, right? This exploration, which is, as I say, subject to many possible interpretations, I think all of which are very good. If I'm to take the film at this level of this idea of penetrating the other, or trying to understand the experience of the other, at least in the context of these two women, Anna and Elizabeth, then I think that is the great foundation upon which I can move forward in this Criterion created order, right? Because we go there from there. Oh, and I should say also that I think it's very key that these are two women, Anna and Elizabeth, and so with that general foundation, I think we can move forward with the next film, which is the film Thirst. Now, the film Thirst is very interesting as it comes here because, as I said, it's from, it is from 1949. So we're already getting a jump backwards in time. And film Thirst is I would say it's a seemingly simplistic film, especially coming off the heels of Persona, right? Because it feels very simplistic. It feels like it's just or not just, but it's a story about a couple, and it's a story about their traveling home, and they're basically recalling experiences in the past with maybe other loves, or experiences in the past that have to deal with other people that they've had relationships with. So it's an exploration of their own relationship, also in the context of how they have had, or how they have dealt with past relationships. So I think in the very general sense, we have this idea of a relationship between one human being and another human being put under a microscope. And perhaps this is very akin to Persona. Of course, the differences arise immediately. In Persona, we're not dealing necessarily with a man and a woman and their, let's say, their maybe intimate relationship or romantic relationship that is on the rocks. So there is a slight difference there, I grant you. But I think what is interesting about this juxtaposition between Persona on the one hand and Thirst on the other hand is this. I think on a technical level, I think Thirst is one that please disagree with me if you think this way, but I think that there is a technical achievement that is happening with Thirst. Because if you remember, Thirst is a film that is about a couple that is traveling on train, we assume home, and after a trip. And the film is essentially going through in a kind of flashback structure. Let's say the story of the woman and a past fling that she had with another man. And then with respect to this man in the relationship, the film takes a flashback back, not necessarily to his relationship with another woman, but a flashback structure with respect to a woman with whom the man had a relationship in the past, and her story in the context with other people. So it's a kind of an indirect flashback structure, at least with respect to the man. And I find that to be very elusive, quite elliptical. And in general terms, I think we can find a connection there with Persona from the outset. And just on the concept of Thirst itself, I think on the technical level, that kind of structure, it's not a simple flashback structure if you think about it, is very appealing from my point of view. And I think that makes this film a wonderful example of the kind of explorative curiosity that Bergman has with respect to his characters. I think the other connection that we can make between Persona and Thirst is, if we were to think of Persona, again, as a film between one woman and another woman, and how one woman and another woman relate to one another in the context of this specific relationship between Anna and Elizabeth. I think we can take this Centerpiece 3 perhaps to be generally, or at least one of the primary strands being focus on the relationship between women. And this idea of the relationship between women is very key in Bergman's exploration of humanity, at least vis-a-vis his films. And so why do I bring it up with the film Thirst? Well, I do because, again, the man, Birger Malmsten's character, Bertel, right? Remember, we see him and his relationship with the woman, Ruth, right? But when we have his flashback structure, right, we don't get his story with the past girlfriend. No, we get the past girlfriend's story with and her relationship with another person. And so it's almost like the flashback structures that are employed with both Ruth and then with Bertel, respectively. They're all dealing with structures or stories where we have women at the focus. And so with Ruth's, we have Ruth at the focus, and then we have, with Bertel's, we have Bertel's past girlfriend at the focus. And so I think we're beginning to see this focus on the idea of the impact of relationships and how and we're focusing on how these relationships are impacting these particular women in this point in time. And in particular, the story involving the former lover of Bertel, so Viola, and especially the story between her and Valborg. That story there between the two women is very, I think it's quite unexpected, because again, it comes in the context of the sort of the quote-unquote flashback story of the man's side of things. So, in this sort of story, you would expect to have a flashback of the man and his story and how he met the lover and how they broke up or something. But we don't get that. We just get the lover's story, which is, I think, quite exciting, and it just shows again a kind of focus and interest that Bergman seems to have, which is the impact of relationships on women and what that means for women, especially at this time, right, 1949. Okay, so that's Thirst, and then I think we can take that conceit or that focus of exploration, let's put it that way, into the next film in the curated order, which is 1948, Port of Call. Now, this is 1 year prior to Thirst. And here again, we have a story of a couple, Berit, the woman, and Gusta, the man. But we already, and also we see a kind of flashback structure employed, or some kind of play with chronology. So on this very technical or simplistically technical level, we still get this notion of the use of the the medium of film, to try to suggest to us or to show us this a focus on a particular relationship. But here also we are getting primarily focus on the young woman, Berit's character. And we see her in the context of her growing up and the trials and tribulations, so to speak, of her particular background and her particular youth and family and upbringing, and what that meant for her and what that leads to in terms of her views and her approach and her mindset and just her whole life as a woman at the time she meets Gusta at the start of the film. Right, at the start of the film, she's at a particularly vital, crucial point in her life. And so we see this play out. And again, we see very, I think we're getting a lot more focus on, again, the impact of a relationship on a woman. But I think more interestingly, we're getting the life experience of this particular woman. And it's one filled with a lot of fear for the future. There's a lot of upfront frankness with respect to sexuality. There's a lot of upfront frankness with respect to the notion of pregnancy and motherhood, and especially motherhood at a young age. And so we're beginning to get these I don't know if I don't want to call them real life discussions, because I think that is diminishing the importance of the topics. But this idea, let me put it this way, of the immediate concerns of young women, or of women in general, that are of Berit's age and her generation at the time of this film. Let me put it that way. And I think this is quite critical, and it's very frank, and maybe it could have been more frank, perhaps, but I think in the context of Bergman's filmography, it's very frank indeed. And so I think we're seeing Bergman trying to focus in on the idea of a young woman and what it means for this particular woman in society at this particular point in time. So therefore, already we're seeing this very interesting strand of a thematic connection take place between or among the films Persona and then Thirst and now Port of Call. If we take this conception further, then what's the film that comes next? The film that comes next is Cries and Whispers. So I think, therefore, this thematic strand is beginning, at least in my mind, to take shape, and it holds up pretty well, because Cries and Whispers it's a drama about sisters. It's about a family, of course, but it's primarily about sisters, and also very significantly a maid, a caretaker or maid who is not related by blood, but who is very important in the lives of this family, and in particular of Agnes. So, yes. So this is a film that has at its heart the relationships between and among sisters, in the context of one sister who is unfortunately dying. I think a lot can be said on this film itself. It's one of my favorite Bergman films, actually, and it is every time I see it, I marvel at the point that it feels like it's such a formal film. In other words, it feels, when I put it on, it feels like I should be responding to it like I am watching a very stuffy play, so to speak. That's always my feeling when I turn it on. But every time I'm surprised at how intimate and how engrossed I am by the proceedings. And it's not a stuffy play, and it's not a play with set in a time that I don't have any direct connection with. No, this is a raw exploration. This is quite an intense exploration of relationships, and also this is a very cold, and there are some moments that truly shock me and almost disgust me. And I think that's the point of the film, which is why this film becomes for me so hot and so alive and bubbly. And I'm always surprised by how hot, how alight they are. Everything has become a flame or something. And by the time I finish the film, I feel like my heart is sort of ablaze, so to speak, both with feelings of genuine emotion and also anger, and also of surprise and emotional shock. This film has everything, Cries and Whispers. And then so taking in the context of the Criterion Collection curated order, I think immediately we see the relationships between these sisters, and also the servant, but primarily these sisters, how they related to their mother, how they related between each other or among each other, how they try to relate between and among each other now, how that can lead to things, or maybe they won't lead to things, or maybe things might seem to lead to things and then eventually they won't. The idea of disappointment, the idea of what it means really to have a certain connection, not just on a familial level, but on a real human level. Right? And this idea of maybe we think we have connections because we can call ourselves siblings, but perhaps that is just as ephemeral, that is just as fleeting, that is just as fake and phony as anything. And perhaps the heart of the matter is what it means to have a real human connection. This goes back, therefore, to something that I was trying to bring up in my brief talk about persona, right? This idea of the maybe impenetrable, trying to penetrate the other, but maybe seeming to be able to, but perhaps not really, although I'm not sure. Here, I think we're getting a same or similar kind of dilemma. Some characters are more aware of it than others, I think. And some characters really do try to reach some kind of resolution with this, especially between the maid, the servant, and the dying sister. Yes, and what was I going to say? Yes, and also we have intertwined with this the idea of women and their relationships with men, and women and their relationships with their sisters, and also women and their relationships with their mothers and fathers, but here in particular the mother. And we see how all this impacts, and each of the sisters, or in particular the sister Karen and Maria. The two of them, we see them and how they each interact respectively in their own relationships with men in their lives. So we see different outcomes for each. And it seems to either reflect who they are at that particular point in their lives, or it seems to be something that causes something that leads them to become who they are in this particular point in their lives. Or maybe it's a combination of the two, who knows. But I think in any event, everything is seen through this prism of the understanding or the experience from the viewpoint of each of these sisters. And so this is, I think, the through line that we see here. Everything is from the perspective of these particular women. So, persona, thirst, port of call, and now Cries and Whispers. Here we have a strong thematic thread that I really think is being firmly established by Cries and Whispers here right now. Then if we go ahead to the film Waiting Women, this is an interesting connection too, because I think here we see the this notion of the perspective of women vis-a-vis their respective relationships with men in their lives and the family members in their lives. I think this is at the heart, this is at the forefront of this film Waiting Women, which is essentially a story of three separate women, and they're recounting certain episodes in their lives as they relate to the men in their lives. And it happens that all the men in their lives are related in some way or another. So this is all essentially one big happy family, or happy in air quotes. And we have each of the stories recounted by these three women. And so in essence, we get, again, I think brought to the fore, the viewpoint or the perspective of each of these women vis-a-vis the men in their lives. And this is, I think, a perfect solidification of everything that we've seen up to now. But it introduces something, I should say, that is something that I think we saw a little glimpse of in Cries and Whispers, but I think it's also brought up maybe in passing, but still significantly so in this film. And it's this. It's this idea that in one of the stories in Waiting Women, we have one of the women explaining this idea of how she can deal with the possibility of her husband or her lover or husband here being unfaithful. And it's this idea that the woman seems to use the excuse or has the reasoning that the husband is not really a husband. The husband is more like a child. And so she looks upon him not as a lover, but as a child. And in that sense, she feels like he needs her. Okay. This is a powerful concept in Bergman's exploration of human relationships, I think. We saw this also in Cries and Whispers in a way that was very powerful between two significant characters in that film. But here in Waiting Women, it's also brought up, albeit, I think, in a passing way, but still, this idea of dependence. One character or one person being dependent on another, and that being a kind of echo or an exploration or an expression of a parent-child relationship is fascinating to me. And this ties in so well with this theme that is being laid out here, this exploration of the impact of life from the perspective of women. And motherhood and this idea of being dependent or being depended upon, and this idea of children in one's lives, whether they be actual children or whether they be emotionally in terms of an emotional relationship. Maybe the relationship between, in other words, what I'm trying to say is a relationship between a woman and a man that could be intimate from the outset. Maybe it turns into one where the woman and the man are such that the woman acts as a kind of motherly figure to the man. This kind of relationship introduces the concept of motherhood quite literally, and this leads us very nicely to the film Brink of Life, because Brink of Life is at its core about motherhood, and in particular the emotional and physical implications of becoming a mother. Not necessarily the idea of motherhood over time, as a child grows up from an infant to a young adult, like we might have seen glimpses of in earlier films like Crisis, for example. But, motherhood in terms of the stages of pregnancy and what that means in terms of physical implications on the body, and also emotional implications, what that means in terms of emotional wants and needs. And you add into this interesting strands here, whether one wants to be a mother, whether one seeks not to be a mother. And if one seeks not to be a mother, what does that mean? What happens if one wants to be a mother and one is unable to have a child? What does that mean? What happens when what happens then when you have three separate women each with different backgrounds coming together in the same room in the maternity ward? What happens there? This is at the heart of the film Brink of Life. I should say that Brink of Life is it brings to the fore a couple elements that I think are so key to Bergman as a whole. One is the face, the close-up of the face. And now we've seen the close-up of the face in other films as well. Cries and Whispers, of course. Persona. Gosh, what am I talking about? It's all about the face here. So we're seeing here, not just in Brink of Life, but in this entire Centerpiece 3, two things. One is the importance of the face, the close-up of the face. In Swedish, what is it? It's the word is ansikte. And so this is so important. We see so much of this in Brink of Life, and the pain and the sorrow and the joy and everything in between that is occurring during this particular stage in the lives of these women. But also we hear the scream. Screams in Bergman's films, I think, are very significant, and they can be screams of joy, screams of happiness, or screams of pain and screams of horror. It's basically up to you to determine what the significance of a scream is, but we get this a lot, and I think watching Brink of Life has reminded me of that very much significantly. So let's tie it back into our previous discussion, and we see now that this Centerpiece 3 is continuing on with the perspective of the women, and now we have very directly here these perspectives in the within the story of pregnancy, and then also in this kind of clinic this hospital, and also how this seems to impact the various relationships and emotional states of mind of these women, and how this seems to relate them to other people, not only in their own lives, but also in the lives of this particular hospital community. Gosh. So now we've come to Brink of Life, and then when we spoke about motherhood in Brink of Life, we spoke about it at the very outset, at the very just as it's about to begin, so to speak, in the stages of pregnancy. But then Centerpiece 3 then jumps, of course, to the film Autumn Sonata, which is a later film. And Autumn Sonata is a film that is, of course, about motherhood, but it's motherhood at a particularly different stage. It's certainly not motherhood in the context of pregnancy. No, this is a very unique relationship between a mother and a daughter, or in this case, two children, one daughter in particular, and 1978. And this is, I think, such a great way to end Centerpiece 3, because we have this, and also it's also great, first of all, because we go from this idea of motherhood and the emerging discussion of motherhood, and then this great discussion of Brink of Life as in term. It's not motherhood necessarily, but it's it's pregnancy, which is of course an important stage, the most important stage prior to the actual this idea of the relationship between a mother and a child. In Autumn Sonata, of course, we have the relationship between a mother and a child. In this case, we have the mother and the grown-up woman. And also there is a sister there, but it's primarily between the mother and the grown-up woman. And this is, it's autumn, and it's cold, and it feels like it's the closing of a chapter in many ways, because this is a very cold, austere film that is suddenly brought a light. It's basically, it turns itself on fire because of the charged emotional drama and the almost the seething vitriol that exists, especially from the daughter's perspective towards the mother. And we have the mother here, Charlotte, played by Ingrid Bergman, of course, who is one of those. I said I was going to spoil it, but I don't think I'm spoiling it by saying that I think she is perhaps one of the most memorable mother figures in cinematic history. I'm not sure if she's a villain. She could be, but I think it's more complicated than that. But I wouldn't be surprised if people saw the film and considered her to be one of the most villainous characters in all of Bergman's filmography. I don't necessarily espouse that view fully, although I do appreciate someone holding that view, because her Charlotte is a well, let me put it this way. I would never want to have a mother like Charlotte, that's for sure. But in any event, this film explores this very tense relationship between mother and daughter, Eva and Charlotte. And as it plays out, we see certain aspects of their own lives and how that reflects who they are. But I think it's really about the mother and the daughter and the inability of one to understand the other. And it goes back, I think, relationship between mother and daughter, the inability of one to understand the other. I think that is the perfect way to tie it back to Persona, and thus tie all of the films in Centerpiece 3 this way. right? Because remember, persona, at least I contend, is about the dilemma of trying to understand the other but not being able to, or perhaps trying to, and maybe perhaps leading to some possibility for the future. Who knows? It depends on how optimistic one is or how cynical one is. It depends on your point of view. I think the same can be true for Autumn Sonata. The ability or inability of one to understand the experience of the other, although one tries to. And here it's in the context of a mother-daughter relationship, and it's a very tense relationship at best. So, and it's, again, it's connected also. We have two women, and their lives from their respective viewpoints is brought to the fore. Just like everything we've seen in the previous films. And I think, again, it ties so nicely to persona. And again, there is also a lot of ambiguity. We're not quite sure what is going to happen in the future. But perhaps there's some hope. Perhaps there is some light there. Oh gosh, yes. Oh gosh, I should say one other thing about Autumn Sonata to tie it in. There's one character there, who is the sister, who is, of course, ill. And part of her illness is that it's very difficult for her to speak. And so she tries to express herself, but she has difficulty doing so. And she tries to scream and call out, but perhaps very few people can understand. Her sister, Eva, can understand, but maybe there's difficulty on the part of the mother because the mother doesn't visit the children as much as they would like. So I think this is such a great way to end, which is this idea of the characters in the films in Centerpiece 3. They seem to be inhabiting their own respective worlds where they're trying to understand one another, but perhaps having difficulty in doing so. They're trying to penetrate the experiences of others, but are having trouble penetrating the wall that surrounds them from the outside world. And they're trying to experience life as they are in the context, in these films in particular, as they are as women in the societies as they were at that particular point in time. And for some, they find success, and for others, perhaps less success. But I think ultimately it is this idea of trying to break free and trying to penetrate. And what does that mean? Does that mean trying to scream out and trying to say something that is truly at the heart of what you're thinking? Or does it mean trying to touch something and trying to penetrate it and trying to feel it and understand what it means, and maybe not being able to, or perhaps there is some breakthrough. Who knows? That is the ambiguity that is at the core of these films. And I think, again, maybe those of us out there who are more optimistic will see some possibility as to a silver lining. I'd like to think so. Wouldn't you? And so, yes, the notion of trying to understand the other. This is what I think is at the heart of Centerpiece 3. Okay, so that is it for my very brief discussions of Centerpiece 3. I hope that was interesting to you. If not, I really sincerely apologize. It's not my intention to try to give you a be-all, end-all of Bergman's films. I'm just one guy, and I'm not a professed Bergman scholar, and I'm not a great studier of Bergman. So I know more people who are Bergman scholars would have more erudite and key, fundamentally inspired things to say, more things to say that are so brilliant that I would never even begin to be able to compare. So, my comments are quite shallow, so I apologize for that. But again, this is just my general impressions, and I will try to, I do talk about the Criterion films in spine order. So as the Bergman films do come up, I will talk about them as specifically as possible, as I've tried to do in the past, I think, with a film like The Seventh Seal. So I can't wait to do that in particular with the film Persona and Cries and Whispers and Autumn Sonata. And in fact, I think Autumn Sonata and Cries and Whispers come very early in the Criterion Collection spine numbered order. So those videos hopefully will come sooner rather than later. But in the meantime, let me end it there. And if you have any thoughts, comments, or questions, as always, please feel free to leave them down below, and I will try to address them to the best of my ability. Next time, of course, we will be discussing Closing Night, so I look forward to seeing you at Closing Night. To be continued, my friends.